So in this section of notes, we're looking at the executive branch. The president is the head of the executive branch. We have a nice little picture here of the White House where the president lives in Washington, D.C. But don't be confused about this. The White House is where the president lives, where his office is. But if you go to Washington, in between the White House and the Capitol building, where the legislature is and where the Supreme Court and the Judiciary building behind the Capitol, where those buildings are, in between those buildings and the White House, there are a bunch of buildings that are executive branches of our government, or that are part of the executive branch of our government, which the president oversees. So it's much bigger than an operation out of the White House. The things we're going to look at in this chapter are how presidents get elected, the Electoral College, how that works, the requirements to be president, the various roles of the president, the powers and duties that the president has, the way a president can be removed through impeachment, the executive departments that the president oversees, and then some amendments that are related, some changes we made to the Constitution related to presidential elections, terms of office, and succession, and then we'll conclude by looking at the Succession Act of 1947. Now, first of all, the Electoral College. Each state in the United States is given the number of electors in the Electoral College equal to their total number of congressmen. That is the number of members that they have in the House of Representatives by their proportion to their population, and the number of senators. Everybody has 2 senators. So if the smallest state in the union that might only have 1 member of the House of Representatives would have 3 people represent them in the Electoral College because of the 2 senators and 1 member of the House. If you have a lot more members of the House, then you'd have many, many more votes in the Electoral College. So we want to look at a map that will help us to understand this. You see up in the top left-hand corner of this map, you see Alaska and the number 3. That means that Alaska has 3 representatives that go to the Electoral College. That means they have 2 senators and 1 member of the House. And so they get a total of 3 electors. Now, those aren't those elected officials that go. Those are people that will be chosen to go specifically to the Electoral College. Look down at California and consider the size of California. A state like California has 55 people in the Electoral College, and 53 of those would be because they have 53 congressmen or members of the House and 2 senators. So 53 plus 2 is 55. You look over at Pennsylvania. Here in our state, we have 20 electors. That means we have 18 members of the House and 2 United States senators. So that's how we figure out how many electors everybody has. To win the election, the candidate must get a majority of electors, and that means that they must get 270 of the 538 total electors. Now, how does that work in each state? Well, in Pennsylvania, for example. Well, let's cover this point and then talk about that. If no one candidate achieves this majority, then the election will be decided by the House of Representatives. That's interesting because what we see here is we know that from our previous conversations that the most democratic part of our government is the House of Representatives. Those folks get elected every 2 years. They're very sensitive to what people in their district think and what popular opinion says. And so if people run for president and no one gets a majority of electors, then the House of Representatives would decide who among the candidates would be the next president. That's happened in our history. I'll refer you to your history textbooks to talk about that. In most states, if a candidate wins a majority vote in that state, they get all of the electors. So in this upcoming presidential election, let's say Donald Trump is running as the Republican candidate. That would be fascinating, wouldn't it? If you're listening to this in the future, obviously this event is a past event, but basically what we're saying that is if Trump would win California by one vote, the popular vote in California, he would get all 55 electors. Now, there's a couple of states where if you win the popular vote, if you get the number of electors proportionally based on what percentage of the popular vote, but that's you win. But that's not true in most states. In most states, it's a winner take all. You win the majority, you get all of the electors. This sets up an interesting situation because it makes it very possible that you could win the electoral college. You could get the most electoral votes, but actually lose the popular vote. Let's reverse this. California is a really, really big state. Um, you could get demolished in California and lose by a very big margin and get California. But if someone won enough other states by just one vote, they could offset that in the electoral college, even though they might have lost by millions in a large state. Um, you have to understand this is not an accident. The founding fathers knew that it would be possible because someone actually mentioned this. I've seen students mention this before in their posts. It is actually possible for the candidate who wins the popular vote to not be president of the United States because they don't win the electoral college. Now, why would they want that situation to be possible? Well, they believed that it was more important that every state in the union have some significance in presidential elections than the person who gets the most votes becoming president. That's the way they felt. And here's the issue. If we did just a straight popular vote and got rid of the electoral college, California, New York, Texas, large states like that would become incredibly important because that's where the people are. And the candidates would go to those states and campaign like crazy in those states. And other very, very small states would probably, those states that, like Alaska, that only has 3 electors, no one would ever go there. They would become very insignificant. But now, because of the Electoral College, a very small swing state that could go either way, even with a few electors, could prove critical. And so the candidates will go there. Everybody is relevant in the electoral college system. So, like it or not, it was set up to make the entire country relevant and to avoid a situation where only large states matter in the election of our president. The requirements to hold office, to hold the presidency. You must be a natural born citizen to be president of the United States. That means you cannot be naturalized. You cannot become a citizen. If you're not born a citizen of the United States, you cannot run for president. You have to be at least age 35, and you must be 14 years a resident of the United States. And you say, well, if you're a citizen, you'd be a resident. Well, not necessarily. You could have moved abroad. The point is that you can't, you have to live here for a certain portion of your life to become president of the United States. The rules of the president. The president has 6 very important and very time consuming roles. He's the commander in chief, or she is the commander in chief of the armed forces. President is the chief executive. That means they're in charge of executing the laws of the country. They're the chief of state. That means they are the ceremonial head of our government. They go to all kinds of ceremonial functions as the chief of state, the head of the government of the United States. They are the chief diplomat. They are the person that is the connection between us and other countries. Now, that's the 4 core things that really came along with the Constitution. Since the Constitution, we've added that the president now is supposed to come up with legislative ideas to present to Congress. That really wasn't the intention of the founding fathers. Really, they thought the laws would emanate from Congress and the president would either agree or disagree. But now the president is considered to be someone who must put forward ideas and pieces of legislation to be passed. And then lastly, something else they didn't foresee, he ends up to be the chief of his party or her party, and that means they have to fundraise and kind of provide leadership in whatever political party they are in. So some specific powers and duties that go along with these rules. They are charged with the responsibility of executing law. All federal laws, all national laws have to be executed, and the president's job is to oversee that. The president also, along with that, has the power to pardon people who have violated federal law. The president also appoints various officials to head up departments that he's in charge of. He also appoints Supreme Court justices and federal court judges. He is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Also, the president negotiates treaties with other countries. Once a year, the Constitution requires the president to go before Congress, although they don't always, they can send a letter, but they have to report to Congress on how the country's doing, what we call the State of the Union. I showed a picture of this in an earlier PowerPoint. And lastly, the president's job is to veto or sign legislation that is put on their desk. So Congress, as we saw, they pass a law. Both houses of Congress, the same exact wording, puts it on the president's desk. The president can sign the law, and that makes it become officially a law, or they can veto it. That means it goes back to the Congress, and the only thing the Congress can do with that is either override it with a 2/3 vote, or it just dies. The one other thing in this section that the president can do is what's called pocket veto. The pocket veto is when the president just doesn't even pick up the thing. It's put on his desk to sign, and he leaves it sit there. If the president leaves a bill sit on his desk that's been passed by Congress, if he lets it sit on his desk for 10 days and he doesn't touch it, and Congress goes out of session during those 10 days, then we call this a pocket veto, which means that the bill will just die. He didn't actually have to sign it or veto it, it just dies. If the president does this and Congress stays in session for 10 days, then the bill would actually become a law. So it would become a law without his signature. So that's kind of an interesting little variation on signing or vetoing legislation. The president can only be removed by a process that we call impeachment. The Constitution establishes reasons for impeachment as treason, bribery, and other high crimes should be or misdemeanors. Don't get confused with misdemeanor. That's not our present use of the word. What happens in the impeachment process is it must begin in the House. Again, the House of Representatives, the most democratic part of our government, most sensitive to popular opinion. They're the only people that can start this process. They would draw up and pass articles of impeachment. And when they do this, they become the prosecutor in the trial of the president. In that trial, the Senate would be the jury, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would be the judge. The president is the defendant. We've done this a couple of times in our history. The impeachment trial, is concluded with a vote of the Senate, and it has to convict a president and remove them from office. The Senate must vote by a 2/3 majority. That has never happened. We've had impeachment trials. We have never removed a president. Conviction simply means removal from office. It's not a criminal trial. The president does not, no matter what they've done, they do not go to jail based on impeachment conviction in an impeachment trial. So this is an important semantical thing. We've had 2 presidents impeached. We've never had a president convicted. We've never had a president removed. To say a president's been impeached just means there's been a trial. To say they have been convicted is a different thing. Now, the one president who wasn't impeached because he resigned first is Richard Nixon. He most likely would have been impeached and convicted had he stayed in the office, but he resigned before all of that took place. Now, the president, he or she presides over an incredibly large bureaucracy of departments. The core departments are the 4 that really were envisioned by the Constitution. Department of State, which handles relationships with other countries. Department of Treasury, which handles our money. Department of Justice, which executes the laws. Department of Defense, which is the department that defends the country. If you are a conservative or a libertarian, you probably would say this is about where it should be. This is what the government should be doing. If you are a liberal or a socialist, then this next slide is where you would be more inclined to go. Here are the additional 10 departments that have been added since those original 4 and the writing of the Constitution. Department of the Interior, they would take care of parks and all kinds of things related to the country. Agriculture, commerce, talked about how important that idea of commerce power. Labor, this is where you get minimum wage laws and occupational safety and health. Uh, Housing and urban development, this is where you get federal housing projects. This is where I work in ministering to folks that live in some very bad neighborhoods that the federal government built, drew poor people into, and then we see a lot of stuff happen there that people that need a lot of help there. Transportation, our highways, our energy, health and human services. This is now where a lot of welfare type programs would come out of. Healthcare, uh, education, government being involved in education, and Veterans Affairs, which is kind of an extension of obviously the Department of Defense. And so these 10 departments, most of them, if you ask where's the constitutional power here, remember when we talked earlier about those words in the Constitution: general welfare, necessary and proper, and the Commerce Clause. Those 3 areas of our Constitution, depending on how you interpret those, if you interpret those areas of the Constitution strictly as they were intended to be written, then you believe in only having those first 4 departments. If you interpret them broadly, which is what we have done in our history without question, then you get 14 total departments. You get 10 new, big, broad areas in which the government operates today. Now, some things that have happened since the Constitution was signed and into law and approved. First of all, with regard to presidential elections, the founding fathers did not anticipate national political parties. There were political parties, but they were all very localized when the Constitution was written. They had no idea of the system that was going to develop as it has today nationally. So they thought that there would be this electoral college, and each state would kind of figure it out. They would get their electors, and they would figure out who they're going to vote for, and they would figure out their own process of choosing their electors. And those electors would go to the electoral college, and whoever got the most votes would become president. Whoever got the next most votes would become vice president. They had a very simple idea. The problem with that is that shortly after they wrote the Constitution, we ended up with these national political parties, and we end up with campaigns, and we end up with presidents running with running mates that are vice presidents. And the problem with that is that in one particular election, people argued that they didn't know whether the president had gotten the votes or the vice president had gotten the votes in the electoral college.
Amendment number 12 provided separate ballots for president and vice president because of issues of running mates that had developed around the 1800 election. And so Amendment 12 creates a situation in which you actually list out who you're voting for president and who you're voting for vice president. And then Amendment number 23 allocated electors to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. Is not a state. Is created as a separate part of the country where the federal government would be housed. And as a result of that, they had no representation in presidential elections. And so Amendment 23 allocated electors to Washington, D.C. With regard to presidential terms, the Constitution itself did not set a limit on the number of terms a president could serve. As a result of that, we ended up going with a precedent that George Washington established when he refused to run for a 3rd term and said that 2 terms was enough. And essentially, no one violated this unwritten rule until 1940. 1940. And that was when Franklin Roosevelt ran for and won a third term in office in 1944 during World War II. And then he ran again and won a fourth term in 1944. And so, following that, during the next presidency, the presidency of Harry Truman, we passed Amendment 22, ratified in 1951, which limited the president to 2 terms, which was a direct response to Franklin Roosevelt being elected 4 times to the presidency.
Section 1 of the amendment says no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. No person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once. Now, what this is saying is, let's say you're vice president, and 2 days after the president is inaugurated, he dies, and you serve the rest of his term. You can't be elected 2 more times. That's considered to be one of your 2 terms. If, though, he dies on the other side, in the second half of his 4-year term, and you only serve out less than half of his term, you could go and be elected 2 more times. So a person actually could be president for 10 years if the situation worked out correctly. Another issue was presidential succession. The founding fathers did not anticipate all of the modern issues with regard to presidential succession. In the nuclear world that we live in today, it becomes paramount that a president be succeeded immediately, and there be no questions about that process. Article 2 of the Constitution says simply that if the president dies, resigns, or is unable to discharge his powers, that the vice president takes over. It actually doesn't even say he becomes president, it just says takes over his duties in cases of death, resignation, or inability. We amended our Constitution with Amendment 20 and said if the president-elect dies, the vice president-elect becomes president. That's a question of what if before they're president, what happens? Someone gets elected next year and the president-elect dies before they actually take office. What would happen? Well, the vice president-elect would take office. And Amendment 25 says that when a vice president takes over the duties of president, they actually become the president in title. And it also allows for the temporary transfer of power. For example, if a president goes under anesthesia during an operation. And it created what I call, and you won't find this anywhere, so don't Google it, the 24 rule. And I have a reason for calling it that. The 24 rule, again, my name, is in this amendment. It says whenever the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide transmit to the president pro tem of the Senate and Speaker of the House their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the vice president shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting president. Now, the reason I call this the 24 rule is because I am a fan of the popular television show 24, and I was watching that one season, and I saw this actually occur where the vice president actually and the executive cabinet members they conspired against the president, and they did kind of a coup, and the vice president was able to secure a majority of those people, and they wrote the letter, and the president was removed from office, and the vice president took over. But if the president disputes this decision, Congress must affirm it within a specific time by a 2/3 vote. So this actually can happen. And I didn't know it could happen until I saw it on television, and I researched it and I thought, oh my, that's actually in the Constitution. And so that actually could occur, but it must be affirmed by Congress within a specific time by 2/3 vote. So there are protections against that. But the idea is, how will we know the president is non-functional? Who's going to know that? who's going to know the president is unable to carry out their duties? And this is a process that they put into this amendment to safeguard that.
And finally, on the issue of presidential succession, the Congress passed in 1947 what's called the Succession Act of 1947. It established the line of succession if both the president and vice president die. And so that line of succession is after the president and vice president, the Speaker of the House, then the Senate President pro tem, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, and then through the rest of the cabinet departments. And I think there's about 17 or so total people in that presidential succession line. If you're interested about more about this and presidential succession or any of the topics we've been discussing here in this presentation, there's a website here at the bottom of this slide that will give you more information and help you to understand this better.